So we have an overview. I'm sure there's lots of questions. Should we just take them out of the chat?
Yeah, there's some in the chat. Thank you very much. I wrote down like 8 bullet points that were interesting to me. And so Lake County, go ahead and feel free to ask more detailed questions of Kara and Katie. And then I wrote down some questions that I have just from the data side as well. So
I believe we already have a question in the chat.
Okay, I can start with that one. How is housing set up for the individual? A vast majority of our housing programs, so one of the things that Abode does, we manage housing subsidies for cities and counties. And so they give us a pool of money, they give us folks that they want us to house. So we have housing specialists. Katie described that position, and they build relationships with landlords and secure apartments, much in the same way that you or I would secure an apartment. If we were looking for an apartment, they go through the application process, and they get approved to live in that apartment. And depending on if it's rapid rehousing or permanent housing, we'll sort of dictate how long we'll pay a subsidy for, how much subsidy we're going to pay. But in permanent housing, it's usually 30% of their income, and it's a long-term commitment that we're making to supporting that person in housing by buying down their rent. We do purchase on the development side, we do purchase land and buildings to be rehabbed or to build and create more housing in the communities that we're in that are dedicated to unhoused individuals.
One thing I can say in terms of the landlord property management relationship, I think we've worked with, I want to say our last count was almost 1,100 private landlords all through the Greater Bay Area, including Santa Cruz and San Francisco too this year. And generally speaking, we have incredibly good relationships with owners because we acknowledge that we want this to be a win-win experience for our participants and for them. There are times, and I would be foolish to deny it, there are times when it doesn't go well. I mean, it's absolutely true. By and large, however, we've found that things like clear communication, honesty, and empathy really work when having conversations with property management companies and owners, because ultimately their goal is just like ours. We want people to be housed and they want to get paid rent. It's pretty simple at the end of the day. Now it can be complex in the day-to-day dynamics at times, but and we don't ever promise things we can't deliver. So we don't say to property owners, this is going to be great, nothing's ever going to happen. Because we've realized that whether it's our participants or anybody else in the world as a renter, stuff happens in rental situations. That's a very normal thing. Someone experiencing a housing or homeless crisis is not guaranteed to be a bad tenant, and somebody who's got a ton of money isn't guaranteed to be a good tenant. Those two things are real, and we acknowledge that with property management companies and owners to say, we acknowledge that being a landlord is a difficult way to make a living, and we're doing our best to make the best match with the participant that we're placing in your unit. And as things unfold, we will promise to be in communication with you, we'll promise to be honest with you, and we'll promise to be honest with you about our limitations, because ultimately we also acknowledge that there's a relationship and a contractual relationship between a landlord and a participant that they also have to honor. And we encourage participants to we encourage landlords to do their role and to really take that role seriously in connection with us.
Mm-hmm. I would add the other thing that's really important in that relationship is responsiveness.
Yes.
And so I think why landlords are willing to partner with us is because, one, we can guarantee rent, and especially in this climate of COVID, rent is not always guaranteed. You will get our portion of rent. And the other thing is that we're going to be responsive. And so I think one of the biggest things that landlords want to know is that if I'm going to support this person that may have more challenges, will you be there to support me when people are struggling? And yes, we will. We will engage the services team. Our housing team will be there to support the landlord. And that's something that we can say consistently that we will do. Natalie?
My question, I actually have just a couple quick questions, and I apologize if I missed it at first. Is Abode specifically a nonprofit or a for-profit company?
Oh, we're a nonprofit.
Okay, I figured so, but I wanted to be sure. Best practices for finding your landlords. We've been doing a really big push in Lake County. We're kind of just like getting our feet wet at this point. But what has been your best practices for identifying landlords that want to work with you?
It's a great
Maybe I'll let
question.
you take this one.
Yeah, and it really does depend on your context. I mean, I think the easiest way is Craigslist is one of the biggest ways we find units. I know it sounds a little bizarre, but just get on there, check units out. Understand your program dynamics and your restrictions / opportunities. Probably the other piece, besides sort of the obvious, like where you look, but landlord incentives are incredibly helpful. Providing an initial signing incentive for owners is a really great incentive. Providing a risk mitigation fund for in the event that the security deposit doesn't cover damages on a unit. I will say in all my time at Abode, I would say the mitigation incentive is the least used incentive that we have in a lot of our programs. The bonuses tend to be the initial bonuses tend to be the most used, in spite of the fact that owners often ask about mitigation because it's a really common
Peace
question.
of mind.
Yeah, it tends to be more peace of mind than actually used, for sure. Did I answer your question?
You did. I have just one more, if I might. You have a split side where you have housing specialists that work with specifically landlords, and then it sounds more like kind of like a case management team working with the tenants. How often are they in contact, or how often are you doing at least client contact? I would be, because that seems to be more people will say cycle out, if that's not continual. So how often is that contact kept between on the case management side?
So it can be anywhere from weekly to monthly, depending on if someone's new into housing. We always say like the first 90 to 180 days are the most crucial days. And oftentimes, if you can get people through that initial phase, I would say 95% of our folks sort of stabilize and settle, and they get into a routine and they understand what they need to do to keep their housing. And so that's really the most intensive period, and we really want to up services a lot during that time. And then we'll adjust them based on how people are stabilizing. For some of our, for some of our populations, if they have serious mental illness, it might be continuously that you're having to see them daily or weekly because, they're just up and down with sort of the things that they're managing in their lives. And then there may be other folks that really stabilize, and it might just be a monthly check-in with them. We always try to have those at least once a month. And more in the beginning or more with people that are less stable, that those visits are in person at the unit. One, because that's how you engage and build relationship. It's much harder for most of our populations to build relationships over the phone and via video. So it's really important that your case managers and your social workers are going in person. And two, people will tell you, everything's fine. I don't understand why you're getting all these calls. And then you show up and you see somebody calling again, you're like, the ceiling is falling in on your unit. Like, let's talk about that. And it's hard to when you're on the phone with someone, it's hard to sort of challenge their perception of what they think is going on around you. So it's really important to see what's actually going on, so you can have some of those honest, supportive conversations before it gets to the point of no return with a landlord.
Thank you so much. We got lots more questions. I think in the chat, and Carrie had her hand up there.
Okay. Carrie.
Thank you guys for such a wonderful presentation. I just had a quick question about, if you have someone who is using substances. So I heard you saying motivational interviewing and I agree, harm reduction is the way, and it's easier to get somebody to look at what's going on with their substance use when they're housed as opposed to unhoused. So, do you mandate treatment? Or is it strictly like client voice, client choice? And then you just continue to work with them with MI and motivating them. So that would be somebody that you would likely see on a weekly basis, right?
Right.
And
Yeah, so we never mandate services.
Okay.
It needs to be driven by the client, but because what we know is until somebody's ready to change, they're not going to change, right?
Exactly.
So I can mandate them, but the minute that mandate is lifted or that threat of whatever they're going to lose is lifted, they're going to go back to. So,
Okay.
you know, and I see new people do this all the time, but I'm going to tell them they have to do it. And I just am like, okay, let me sit back and see how this works for you. But yeah, a lot of MI, a lot of relationship building, a lot of removing the shame and blame.
Right.
Because that's what keeps people in secret. If people can have open, honest conversations, even when it's not going well, then we can leverage that therapeutic relationship. We can really talk about what's going on. It's really hard when people feel like they have to be in that denial and hide things from you. That's the hardest. Sometimes those are the hardest folks to work with in housing.
Right.
Because you can't, it's really hard to penetrate and have any sort of a solution-based conversation with them.
Right. Right. Definitely have to build that relationship, and they have to see that, you know, you are not there to force stuff on them. So I totally agree. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Do you put a time limit with them, or do you just continue helping them?
So permanent housing is permanent.
Okay.
You know, we do encourage people to step down services or graduate from services, but where we live, at least in the Bay Area, even if somebody stabilizes in sort of their health and their mental well-being, they may not ever make enough money to pay for rent on their own. So they may ongoing need that housing subsidy. We see this a lot we have full service partnership mental health programs. And we see, you know, because that intensive clinical wraparound services, we see people really, really, really stabilize to the point where they don't really need full service partnership level services, but
Right.
they ongoing need that subsidy support because they're still permanently disabled. They're still on SSI. They might have gotten a part-time job, but they're not, you know, for the most part, we're not seeing people make, you know, you gotta make like, maybe they gotta pay rent sometimes on your own. I have social workers with degrees that have a hard time paying their rent.
Right. Right.
And then we have rapid rehousing programs where the model is really short-term, but those tend to be with folks that have less barriers to housing, more work history, more opportunities to increase their income to be able, and it is said from the very beginning of those programs, this will, you know, will support you with your subsidy for X amount of time. And we're working towards you being able to take over rent on your own at the end of this program.
Perfect. Thank you.
What are your strategies in regards to shared housing and a no barriers program? We don't do a ton of shared housing. We have, you know, there is, you may want to talk about this. Do you do more in Santa Clara County with your HVAC program?
Well, that, and when you say shared housing, we do actually a decent amount of folks renting rooms in houses. So it's a little different than shared, especially in our PSH program, permanent supportive housing programs, actually. So shared housing is great when it's great and not when it's not. I think you're going to hear everybody who does it say exactly that same thing. I would say for certain demographics within our population, it's a really great option, especially renting a room in a home. That has tended to work really well for a number of our folks. We haven't seen as much success as I would like, to be transparent, of like 2-bedroom apartments and asking folks to share housing. I feel like that's a great idea, and I've heard a number of providers talk about how great it is, and I believe it's a great idea, but it can be really hard. And I think if someone in an agency is going to do it, I think you have to really focus on it. You have to do things like roommate contracts and really having conversations about how you match folks up in a housing situation. So the ways that I've seen it work in other agencies has been to do that work. And that isn't something that Abode does as a regular practice, but certainly has done over time, but much more so renting rooms and houses, which can really work depending on the context. Looks like
strategies for a no barriers program. Can you say a little bit more about that, Diana?
Yeah, hi. I'm Diana Mori. I'm a housing case manager with NCO New Digs. And the thing that we have been kind of running into, especially within my caseload, is that I'm working with large families. But then I also have single individuals with one child. And so the option comes onto the table to suggest shared housing. And with the rentals in our area being so scarce, the availability for smaller studios to 1 bed, 1 bath places, there's like nilch. There's not a lot. So what we do have are like 3 2s or 2 2s that have the higher rents, but can be split between these families. But the problem that we're kind of running into is that while we're a no barriers program, which means there can be past or present substance abuse, there can be a lot of different issues, but we want to be able to have you house first and then delve into those things as well. What we've kind of found is that after being housed, we end up finding out about certain things that we now need to deal with. And my kind of question revolves around the fact of like those tenant contracts or house rules, or the way our program works is that we're a 6-month housing subsidy, but we're tiered. So we provide 6 months of tiered housing subsidy, and then an additional 6 months of case management after that to be able to mitigate any issues after, in the hopes that at that 6 months, they'll be completely self-sustainable. Now that doesn't always work out. But some of the times it does as well. So my general question is, how do you do you do personality tests? Do you kind of look over your case of it and see who would kind of fit better together?
Sure.
And then after those issues might come up after they're housed, how do you kind of work with the landlord, work with the tenant to make sure that everybody is on the same page as far as comfort level and confidence moving forward?
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to that. And I would say this is not our major area of focus. I can suggest a few options, but I do know actually if there are other agencies that this really is their major area of focus. So the first thing I'd suggest is find one of those agencies, because I do think it's an important, in order to do it successfully, roommate agreements matter, house meetings matter. So ensuring that there's some regular agreement, and a lot of this stuff has to be done before people move in. Because once someone moves in, sort of the game changes, right? That's true for most folks, I think. So ensuring that folks actually have the chance to choose their own housemates. So one of the things we have experimented with just a tad is creating space for folks to say to us, who do you want to live with? And that's especially been true, and Carrie, you might have seen this as well. We've moved a number of folks from emergency COVID health-related shelters into housing, and because they've been in motel shelters together for a year or two, they know each other. So they're saying, hey, we want to live together. That tends to be more successful than less successful, because we're not the ones making a decision about who might be a good match. I think as a policy, we would try and stay away from us making the decision, but really leaving that decision in the hands of the participant. And then once the participants have agreed, you've got to put a lot of structure in and really be mindful of the structure. As things come up, I would say you probably treat it the way you treat anything else. If there's a tenant-related issue, the tenant-related issue needs to be negotiated and dealt with so that it doesn't impact the person's housing. If it's a behavior-related issue that's just maybe uncomfortable for those living in the unit, that has to be an open, transparent conversation, hopefully with service providers in the room. So hopefully, I don't know that I answered it fully, but I think there are agencies, and I know of one at least in San Mateo County, that actually makes it's their mission to do this kind of work, and I'd be happy to pass on that referral if it was helpful.
That would be wonderful. I'd greatly, greatly appreciate that.
Yep.
I'll put my email in the chat box.
Great. Yep. Cool.
What is your practice on housing unaccompanied youth? We don't do a lot of work with unaccompanied youth. We have TAY programs, so transition age youth. But yeah, not a lot of, and we certainly serve minors as part of families. We don't work with a lot of youth. How long are you offering rental support under your programs, and do you have more income streams than HUD and state funds? Most of, I think I answered this a little bit more. I don't know if I need to expand on this, but if it's permanent, there are subsidies offered to them permanently. And I would say most of our contracts are HUD contracts. We have city, county, state funds as well. Any pockets of money that I'm sort of missing, Katie?
No, but I think one thing to speak to that is also the length of subsidy. PSH, as Kara said, is long-term housing. Rapid rehousing best practice tends to be 24 months. So anywhere between 3 to 6 to 12 to 24 months tends to be the practice.
Got through all the questions. Oh, Brian.
I know what Brian's going to ask.
Oh, am I that predictable? Hi there. Thank you very much for that. I am a case manager with the emergency shelter here in Lakeport. So my question is about cost. When you talk about sufficient supports, obviously, I was wondering if you could speak to what those supports are. And given that Lake County is a different community that has a narrower tax base and less access to expertise and so forth, what are the most cost-effective supports for a smaller community to adopt?
Can you clarify a little bit what you mean by cost-effective strategy? I guess I'm trying to. Can you maybe? I want to make sure I understand your question. Can you ask it differently, perhaps?
Well, I mean, if we could start out by you said specifically anyone can succeed in housing if given sufficient support.
Mm-hmm.
And so what are those supports? And I mean,
Got it.
For example, we don't have permanent supportive housing at all in Lake County, and so that gives you, obviously the context. So where do we begin when we don't have a lot of money to work with?
Yeah, we Abode, anyways, and the communities that we work in, we are not in the business of putting people in housing without the proper support. So there's always case management services that are built into those, either HUD contracts or maybe HUD pays for the housing portion of it in the county through the healthcare system. We're doing a lot of work in a lot of our counties to leverage CalAIM, which is sort of the next iteration of whole person care, and getting sort of the health plans to pay for services for our most vulnerable people. So I know that is one way that our communities are leveraging the money needed to provide support, but we don't put people in housing without some level of support. Now, it might be a little bit more short-term, lighter touch, but not really even for rapid rehousing. But there's always supports attached to housing when we put people in housing. I don't know if that helped you.
Did it help, Brian?
Yes, thank you.
Kind of good.
Okay.
Doreen, did you have a question?
Yeah, a little bit about the financing and stuff. And so since we don't have any permanent housing, but we could go through mental health with some of their, because they do provide housing for clients. But again, they would have to adhere to mental health, protocols on that housing. But so when you leverage, when you have a client and you're moving them into mental health, is there an MOU in place, or how do you go about doing that?
So usually if we are moving somebody into housing and they have a mental health provider, we get an ROI signed so that we're able to talk openly and do care coordination. At a lot of our permanent supportive housing sites, we have on-site resident services. So they are sort of immediately available to tenants and providing sort of light touch. And so that's where we would have the ROI. So we'd sort of be the ones that's dealing on, because we're on site, supporting people in the most immediate with a crisis, but then we want to call in their mental health team to provide that sort of clinical support and the long-term planning around that person. So it's a lot of relationship building, a lot of ROI, so we can have open conversations about how we can partner best. What's our role? What's your role? And how can we work together to support this person so that they can maintain their housing?
Okay, so you kind of, with the ROIs, you guys create a plan for them, basically. All right, cool. Well, that's good to know. Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Kara, I've written down quite a few questions that I'd like to ask because, I'm not a direct service person, but I always like to create the data systems so they support the work. And one of the questions I had for you is, do you all have a pretty good handle on what your case management ratio is at Abode?
Yeah.
I've heard
so
1 to 12, 1 to 15. I heard 1 to 30 down here the other day.
Well, in our, they're much smaller in our FSP programs,
Yeah.
but because we're working with, but I would say generally speaking, in most of our programs, it's about a 1 to 20, 1 to 25
Okay.
ratio.
Okay. That's really helpful to know. I have a question because I'm so much of a believer in the infrastructure of staff to be able to do this job, this role. How do you all kind of manage your professional development internally at Abode, including your talent acquisition, your hiring? How do you keep people from burning out on their work? What do you do in that way?
Well, I'll start, Katie, and then you definitely, hiring's not easy for sure, and it's become even harder during COVID. And so we, have a really talented HR department that, we've gotten really creative about the different ways. I mean, we're doing Indeed and we're doing all of that. But really, we've had to think outside the box of where we recruit people for positions. We bring them in, and I think one of the things that we do really well is we have a pretty robust training program. So we're both in the process of getting CARF accredited, and we have a robust training team. So we bring a lot of external training in, and then we also have a lot of, over the years, trainings that we have created that people can access as part of their onboarding, which we call Abode University. So there are videos that we've created that help them to get those training. And so we usually couple those videos to give them sort of what they need in the immediacy of coming on board with us, so that they understand their jobs and understand their best practices, and then bringing external providers in. Supervision is really, really important, that people feel supported, not only by supervisors, but we have an open door policy. So supervisors can be available to people to support them. And we really create a culture on the teams where everybody supports each other. I did see a question of somebody asked, what does our training look like? So I did, this is just sort of the trainings that we provide for our service staff. And some of these also are available to our housing staff. And then they do a whole other array of trainings. But I did see that question come up. So I asked our training team, what all do we offer? And this is sort of basic Abode one-on-one training that we would provide to a new staff person. Katie, I think I'm missing a ton of things. How else do we support staff?
I think one of the biggest ways you actually got most of it, I think the biggest that I have found really valuable over the years is we're just honest. And I think letting people process what it's like to do this work is really important. Not so much for the sake of complaining about the work, but being honest about the challenges and the joys. We try to celebrate successes, but we also create a culture of openness and transparency. And we start that with our management teams and really giving them space to talk about how things are going. We find that when talking about things like regular self-care and regular transparency, it really helps, because I don't think there's anybody in the agency that feels like we're not aware of how draining the work can be. And I think creating that culture makes a difference to people. Certainly providing lots of expertise, peer-to-peer expertise. I think we've got a lot of structures set up to help people just talk about best practices, and I know I feel like I'm bragging about Abode a little bit, but got a lot of really smart, well-versed people in the work, and I feel like they're is very rarely a time where there isn't a chance to talk to someone who knows something more than someone else does. And I think that creates a sense of confidence and a sense of like, it's all going to be okay. It's not easy, but it's all going to be okay. But it isn't easy to retain good staff. That's absolutely true. It isn't easy to hire good staff. We've been incredibly fortunate to have a really strong workforce.
A lot of clinical supervision into our programs as well. So both to attract clinically trained people that might be working towards licensure, but also everyone from case managers to peers that work with our more vulnerable populations, our chronically homeless populations, have access to talk through cases and get a little bit more expertise. And we also created a CIDT team. So, you know, when you do this work, especially when you're working with chronically homeless populations, you see there's a lot of trauma that gets sort of transferred to you. There's a lot of death that sometimes happens, a lot of tragedy. And so our critical incident debrief team was really built to support staff. So if they experience something in the workplace, either as an individual or as a team, this team quickly comes in and helps them to process that incident. And, you know, it's just a really safe space. It's usually not people that they interact with on a daily basis or that has any jurisdiction or supervision over their work. So we usually take people that are from a different part of the agency that they wouldn't normally see in their day-to-day work and really provide that safe space for people to process what's going on for them.
Kara, are you all still do you take all your referrals from Alameda County Coordinated Entry, or are you allowing a little side door? How does that work now?
We are the anti-side door. It makes me cringe when we do side door. I'm like, let's do coordinated entry. And all of our communities were really taking referrals through coordinated entry. I would say for our rapid rehousing programs in Alameda County, we're not quite taking them from coordinated entry, and that's just because that portion of coordinated entry in Alameda County has not quite been built out yet. But as soon as they implement that, we will be taking referrals for rapid rehousing as well from coordinated entry.
Sonia, your comment in the chat asked if Kara and Katie can talk a little bit about successes with Housing First in transitional housing. And maybe they can do that. However, I will say that Housing First really what Abode does is permanent housing, which is a different HUD category of housing. So I don't know, have you all done anything in the TH space with?
We don't have any transitional housing programs. Any transitional housing programs we have transitioned to rapid rehousing, just because if you look at the data, there's much better outcomes with rapid rehousing than so we don't have any transitional housing.
Okay. I want to just highlight something that Jillian put in the chat too that I thought was interesting. And I think, Jillian, I'm understanding this correctly. You're saying that the landlords you all are seeing, because Jillian's with Homebase and, you know, HUD TA, that they're not really utilizing the risk mitigation funds. Is that right, Jillian? Is that what you were saying?
Yeah, I was just basically confirming what Abode was sharing, that like that's not like a fluke, that it seems to be consistent across the board, which is one of the reasons that we often recommend it, because it does seem to be like a good selling point, because it makes people feel a little better, but ultimately those funds don't often get used, at least not a lot of them.
So more so relationship and trust.
Yeah, more like it's a good thing to have, because it doesn't end up being particularly expensive because it doesn't get used, but it also is like makes landlords feel better especially when you're building your relationships. So I was just confirming that what they shared, we also hear from other communities around the country too.
We also pay double deposit for most of our programs, and so they need to access the deposit before they can access the risk mitigation. We find that a lot of anything that we need to pay for to make the landlord whole again is usually covered by that deposit, that double deposit.
Kara, I have a stumper for you, and you'll probably just pop this right out, but I've told Jillian, as Jillian and I have been meeting over the summer to help develop Lake County's coordinated entry policy, I'm looking for the magic data set Doesn't need to be HMIS data elements, but I'm looking for the magic data set that would support, the fidelity to housing first in your work. What metrics do y'all rely on to know that you're, even if it's qualitative information, how do you know you're staying on the right path? I mean, this may be an obvious question, but I think it gets missed in a lot of housing first discussions.
Yes, Katie's going to help me with this. We definitely look at length of stay in housing, exits to where people are exiting to. We don't do fidelity reviews, to just be quite honest with you all. To do a true fidelity review is very time intensive. We do fidelity reviews for some of our other evidence-based practices through our mental health contracts. But we're not particularly doing them with Housing First. And so I think a lot of this comes out in our case conferencing a lot when we're talking with folks through why somebody might be exiting. And we always have this question of, what did you do? Have we done everything that we could do? And just sort of like spitballing what are things that we can do to better. And so we're always coming from a place of, is there more that we can do to support this person before we get to that place? And I think that it's always sort of a last resort conversation if we're like, we have to exit this person from the program, or we have to exit this person from this housing placement. Katie, you're more in touch with the day-to-day data that your teams are collecting. What did I miss?
I don't think you missed anything. I think the things I would just highlight to say, we tend, at least in the majority of our housing programs, we're looking at things like housing retention, exits to permanent housing. In our PSH programs across our agency last year, it was about 68%. Where I believe was 68% exiting permanent housing. I have to check the number for sure, just looking at our impact report. And for rapid rehousing programs, it's about 74%. So folks that are in those programs and moving on and exiting to good locations. We do a lot of monthly analysis of that data. So it's housing retention, exits to permanent housing, income increase for rapid rehousing programs, and length of time from initial program referral to moving into housing. And we tend to feel like those are pretty good benchmarks for the fidelity of Housing First. And I think we're always looking for ways to increase our outcomes to permanent housing and stabilization in that way.
Are you guys working with I have to ask this, are you working with the home stretch referral system down there? With Colleen?
We get all of,
okay.
We get all of our referrals through coordinated entry.
So I'm just curious because I'm still working on that database with them, but to port it over to the Salesforce. But about how long between when you receive a referral from Homestretch, what's your placement average? 35 days, 50 days, something like that.
I can maybe give you the data across the agency, Kara, if that's helpful.
Yeah,
since I represent different counties than
Sure.
Kara, than Alameda County, but tends to be within 45 to 60 days, tends to be pretty much the benchmark.
All right, cool. Any benchmark is good for me at this point because I don't think that they're broadly published.
Actually, there is one place that they're published, or at least they were the last time I checked. The National Alliance to End Homelessness has some benchmarks that they typically use for rapid rehousing. I'm not sure for PSH, but I know they do for rapid rehousing.
Yeah, I've been looking at that too. I always wonder, to Brian's point, because Lake County is a new COC, new funding within the last 2 years, a lot of capacity building. So I love the benchmarks from National Alliance. I just don't know. I mean, what we're doing right now is establishing baselines. So they have like an improvement thing to go, to move forward on. But there's not a lot of baselines out there. So it's good to know.
I believe that.
Good to know what you all are doing. So does anyone else have any questions? I think, Kara, what would be really good if you could recap a little bit is the thing that I heard that was very interesting, again, not being a case manager or a direct service provider, is you stick with the client wherever they are at in their lives. What causes exits to happen other than moving on? Are there negative exits, and what would those be for you?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's important you can exit a unit and not lose your voucher. And this is complicated because sometimes if your voucher is attached to a site and the site tells you to leave, you lose your voucher. But when we're talking about scattered site housing, sometimes we are at a place where we have to, the landlord's just like, I'm gonna move towards legally removing, well, before COVID, I'm gonna move towards legally removing this person. And we've never won evictions on people's records, so we really do try to get them to leave the site before it gets to that point. And so that might be a time where we really just have to get somebody out of that housing placement. And to be real clear, they don't lose their voucher. So they still have a voucher, and we work to rehouse them. Usually what we want to do is we want to bring the team together and we want to talk about a housing success plan, what that looks like, have some conversations around what happened in your last placement, what are supports that you need, what are you willing to work on, what's going to be different. And we invite housing to be part of those conversations, and they're driven by the services team. And of course, the participant and any support people that they have in their lives. If they have sisters or a caretaker or somebody that's going to help them be successful, we want them at the table because it's a team approach. And then we do really work to rehouse people. Sometimes in Alameda County, what we do, because we luckily have this available to us, is sometimes people will move from more independent to less independent housing and then back to more independent housing. So if we place somebody in an apartment a couple of times and they sort of just blow out of that apartment, what we might try with them is more of a shared housing where there's a house manager that's there throughout the day. It is independent housing. They can come and go as they please. They cannot come home at all. They don't have curfews. So to be really clear, it is independent housing, but it has a little bit more supports on site. So we might have people move there for a little while and then sort of work towards coming back to an apartment on their own in the community. And so those are some of the things that we do. I think that if somebody does something so egregious, they might lose their housing and their voucher. Usually we're working within the policies of the county. So a lot of the counties that we work in have very clear policies as our funders of when people can absolutely lose their housing. And in many cases, they want to be part of that conversation to really make sure that, so there's checks and balances. Have we really done everything that we can for this person? Yeah. But I would say if we multiple times put people back into housing and there's sort of no behavior changes and they're burning down units, they're flooding units, doing things that are high cost. If there's violence involved towards staff, towards landlords, towards neighbors, that sometimes can lead to people, maybe losing their voucher or us not being in a place where we can rehouse them again. But I would say that that's far and few between. Mostly what we see is that people walk away from housing and we sort of lose touch with them. So they become MIA and we're not able to rehouse them. And we see a lot of deaths for sure in permanent housing. So, we exit people because of that. Did I miss anything?
Can I just ask one more question, because I'm curious about it too, because it's come up in our Lake County discussions, which is, and Jillian's been very good at helping frame this for Lake County, the recovery model. I'm always interested in this because I know a couple of dyed-in-the-wool recovery model, advocates out of the city. But in your case management approach, you meet people where you're at, you're accepting of where they're at, you build relationship, but then are your case managers trained to find that inflection point where somebody might say, I want to change, I need a change, this isn't working for me personally, and your case manager knows that that's the time, to come in to say, well, now I can tell you what's available, I can tell you what that might be like. Is that kind of how it works with you, with what the case managers do?
Yes, that's called change talk. We're constantly talking with people. When we hear that drum of the change talk, we hear this little drum in our head. That's change talk. Then we really want to, use our motivational interviewing skills and try to expand that change talk with people. But yeah, we go to the recovery model if that's what people, if they're, you know, letting us know that there is a desire. I think a lot of times people say like, well, harm reduction, you just let people do drugs. No, it's seeing substance use or seeing a harmful behavior on a continuum from doing nothing and supporting that person who wants to do nothing all the way to abstinence and being part of the AA system and everything in between. It's really about having honest conversations without shame and judgment that is driven by the client about where they're at and what they're willing to change, and really going with that and supporting that with folks. And so, yes, we're always looking for change talk. We're always looking for opportunities to provide more support, connect to more resources, have more conversations about how, you know, this treatment program or that treatment program, but we really want to be driven, because what we find is if people aren't there, what it does is it creates people not wanting to open the door to us, not wanting to talk to us, not feeling judged, feeling like they don't want to be honest about what's going on with them. And that's the worst thing that can happen. We don't want to cut off that communication. So we're really sort of doing that dance with people.
Lake County, do you have any other questions? I've tried to just stay, you know, attuned to what I heard the concerns were this summer. Does anybody from Lake County have any other questions or comments? Justin, I know you said you've been studying quite a bit about housing first. How does this square with what your learning has been?
Well, this is all fantastic material. Thank you both of the presenters. We actually have studied the organization and prefer your model. The most poignant things were the cohabiting or putting roommates together. We've seen it work only when they've already been roommates. That seems to be the best thing. So we've already tried it out. You guys can get along. And then, of course, I like what you hit on, the relationships with the landlords. That is absolutely crucial. But thank you. Yes, it aligns with what we've learned.
Great. Wonderful. And Doreen, or Brian, you have a burning question, I can tell.
I feel contractually obligated to ask this question right now. So to what extent do emergency shelters have to comply with housing first? It looks to me in the statute like there might be an exception or a lower requirement. Can you speak to that?
So we run our shelters, and we try to have our shelters be as low barrier as possible. The counties that fund our shelters generally have like a shelter standard that they ask providers to follow. So we use that as a handbook. I mean, I could just say that in Alameda County, there are folks that have different interpretation of what low barrier is. We have shelter providers that are like doing background checks on people and all sorts of like, you know, screening a lot of people out. I guess it's just your commitment to it. As an agency, we've committed to low barrier programs. And that's something we've really worked on with the implementation of coordinated entry. Also, we match to shelter beds in many of our counties through coordinated entry. And so if somebody is interested in shelter, if they score higher on the VI SPDAT or whatever, Alameda County does not use the VI SPDAT, they've created another coordinated entry tool. You know, those are the folks that are going to be matched to shelter that you need to invite into shelter. I think that's where there might be a little bit of rub, is that if you're pulling people into shelters from coordinated entry and you're not calling people that are at the top of the list, I think that's where it could become quite problematic about why you aren't offering these people space in your shelter. I don't know if I really answered your question.
I mean, to an extent, I think that, you know, gets into the question of people being able to access emergency services without participating in coordinated entry in the first place, but that's a can of worms. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Anybody else from Lake County? I'm kind of looking up and down the list. Let's see. Oxel, do you have any things that come up for you, or Holly? I know that Anna has asked some questions regarding youth. Anybody else? I can get you a really good referral, Anna. I was thinking, I wrote it down as we were going through this, to Voices on the Move, which is, I think, in 7 counties now. I don't know if they're in Alameda. Very youth focused, very high end, a lot like Abode, motivational interviewing, a lot of impact, structure and wraparound. So I can get you that, and I'd forgotten about that. And so anybody else from Lake County? I know we're coming up on the 90 minutes, and Jillian, I just wanted to invite you if there's anything you'd like to say as well.
Oh, no, I don't think so. Thanks, though, Teddy.
Okay. So any other questions? And I'm sure, Katie and Kara's email and contact information is up here. But if everyone has felt like this has been helpful to kind of, I guess, bust the myths is what I'm hoping, Kara. When you and I spoke, I said, when it comes to housing first, I see so much black and white thinking around it, and I think you've done a really good job of kind of like smoothing that out for everybody, for me especially. Just saying, making the impossible seem possible, and really where the little management points might come in to help people out with doing that.
So much gray in housing first. There's no black and white at all. And if you have a rigid personality, I mean, probably this is not the model for you. It takes a lot of flexibility and creative thinking.
Yeah.
Yep. I also might say it's also, even though our agency, it's a core value, like beyond almost anything else, right? But we have to reprocess it all the time with staff, with direct service staff who are struggling because they're, folks who are working with landlords are stressed and frustrated, and folks that are working with participants are stressed and frustrated because it doesn't always feel like it's working. But I think when we take the long view, and we have plenty of participants, and Kara, you probably have even more because you've been at Abode longer, but it doesn't work the first time, but it works the third time. And when it works, it's literally magical. And I feel every time I hear a story, when I realize it's going to work, it's inspiring all over again. And I think that's part of the importance of looking at the model is in the long view, not in the short view, because unsheltered crisis takes a long time to develop. And all of the dynamics that exist with that are going to take a long time to undevelop, for lack of a better word. And I think being patient and being willing to hang in there with folks and being willing to continue to do the work and to allow the participant to do their work and to take whatever time it takes for them to do their work, because stuff takes time. It's not fast.
Yeah. Well, you've certainly straightened out a lot of things for me. And I think one of, to speak about reading the state welfare code, or reading a book on housing first, or reading just the checklist, which is what I know a lot of continuum of cares go to, is a checklist. Are you doing this? Are you doing, it barely scratches the surface. And then I think it causes a lot of confusion for the providers, which then comes up with the negativity about housing first doesn't work. I think that the deep understanding of this is really what helps make things work. So I'm really thankful for you. Natalie, did you want, we can, I think everyone has asked questions. I think we're good.
Yeah, I think we are. As long as everyone's good and doesn't have any more follow-up questions. Thanks everyone for staying as well, and for having today. That was awesome.
Really, really, I'm so thankful. So thanks, Kara and Katie. I'll be in touch with you to thank you, and enjoy your beautiful day, Kara, out there on the marina.
My background, I wish this was where I was really at. All right, you guys are great. Good.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Katie.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.